Dennis Rodman's name being thrown into the conversation for the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026 has truly sent shockwaves through the wrestling world. It's one of those stories that immediately grabs your attention because, at first glance, it feels unexpected. When most people hear the name Dennis Rodman, they don't instantly think of professional wrestling. They think of basketball. They think of the NBA. They think of the Chicago Bulls dynasty of the 1990s. They think of championships, rebounds, controversy, wild hair colors, unforgettable outfits, and one of the most unique personalities sports has ever seen. But that's exactly why this conversation is so fascinating. Because Dennis Rodman has never been just a basketball player. He has always been bigger than one sport, bigger than one lane, and bigger than one era. And now, with his name reportedly being discussed for a possible WWE Hall of Fame induction in 2026, fans are divided, intrigued, confused, and in some cases, surprisingly supportive. For some wrestling fans, the idea of Dennis Rodman entering the WWE Hall of Fame feels like a stretch. For others, it feels like a long overdue recognition of someone who brought mainstream attention, crossover appeal, and unforgettable moments to the world of professional wrestling during one of the hottest periods in the industry's history. So the big question is this: does Dennis Rodman actually deserve to be in the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026? And if he does get inducted, what exactly would WWE be honoring? That's what we're going to break down today. Because while Dennis Rodman may not have spent years in the ring the way full-time wrestlers did, his impact on sports entertainment goes far beyond match count. His presence, his celebrity power, his willingness to embrace the madness of wrestling, and his ability to blur the line between legitimate sports and larger-than-life entertainment all made him a very important figure in wrestling's pop culture expansion. And that matters more than some people want to admit. Let's start with the obvious. Dennis Rodman is a basketball icon. There is no debate there. He is one of the greatest rebounders in NBA history, a multiple-time NBA champion, and a key part of one of the most dominant dynasties sports has ever seen with Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. His basketball resume is already legendary. But what made Rodman different from most athletes wasn't just what he did on the court, it was how he carried himself outside of it. Rodman was unpredictable. He was rebellious. He was chaotic. He was theatrical. And in many ways, he was already living like a pro wrestler before he ever stepped into the wrestling world. That's why, when he crossed over into wrestling during the late 1990s, it didn't feel completely random. It felt bizarre, yes, but it also somehow made perfect sense. Because Dennis Rodman and professional wrestling were both built on spectacle. And spectacle was Rodman's specialty. His entry into the wrestling business came during the era when the lines between sports, celebrity culture, and wrestling were becoming increasingly blurred. This was a time when wrestling companies were looking for mainstream crossover stars to generate buzz, attract media attention, and bring in casual viewers who might not otherwise tune in. And Dennis Rodman was exactly the kind of name that could do that. He wasn't just famous. He was controversial famous. He was headline famous. He was people will watch just to see what happens famous. That kind of celebrity power is incredibly valuable in professional wrestling. Rodman's most memorable wrestling involvement came in WCW, where he aligned himself with one of the biggest names in the history of the business, Hulk Hogan. That alone made headlines. Seeing a global basketball superstar standing side by side with Hulk Hogan in the middle of the Monday Night War era was a surreal image, and that's part of why it worked so well. It felt massive. It felt like an event. It felt like something people had to talk about. And in wrestling, that kind of attention is gold. Rodman's partnership with Hulk Hogan was one of the defining crossover celebrity angles of the late 1990s. It wasn't just a random guest appearance where a celebrity waved to the crowd and disappeared. Rodman actually became part of the show. He became part of the story. He leaned into the role. He embraced the over-the-top nature of pro wrestling, and he made it clear that he wasn't there just for a quick cameo. That matters. A lot of celebrities come into wrestling and look uncomfortable. They look out of place. They look like they're there because of a PR obligation. But Dennis Rodman looked like he belonged in the chaos. He understood the vibe. He understood the energy. He understood that wrestling is about creating moments people will never forget. And Rodman absolutely created moments. Now, to be fair, this is where a lot of fans push back. The biggest criticism of Dennis Rodman potentially entering the WWE Hall of Fame is simple: he didn't do enough in wrestling. That's the main argument. He wasn't a wrestler. He didn't have a long in-ring career. He didn't work hundreds of matches. He didn't spend years building up a legacy inside the wrestling business in the traditional sense. And if you judge the WWE Hall of Fame strictly by those standards, then yes, it becomes easy to say that Rodman doesn't belong. But here's the thing. The WWE Hall of Fame has never been only about traditional wrestlers. Not even close. The Hall of Fame has always included celebrities, crossover figures, managers, announcers, executives, and people who made contributions in different ways. WWE has long recognized that professional wrestling is not just about who wrestled the most matches. It's also about influence. It's about visibility. It's about moments. It's about drawing power. It's about impact. And Dennis Rodman absolutely had impact. That's the part that some fans overlook. Rodman wasn't in wrestling for decades, but when he was involved, people noticed. Mainstream media noticed. Sports fans noticed. Basketball fans noticed. Casual fans noticed. The wrestling world noticed. And that's exactly what made him special as a crossover star. He brought outside eyes to the product. That is one of the most valuable things any celebrity can do in wrestling. Rodman's involvement helped strengthen the connection between wrestling and mainstream sports culture during an era when both industries were exploding in popularity. The late 1990s were all about bigger personalities, bigger moments, and bigger headlines. Rodman fit that era perfectly. His image alone made him stand out. His hair, his tattoos, his fashion, his energy, he looked like someone built in a laboratory to appear on a wrestling show. Everything about him screamed attention. And attention is the currency of professional wrestling. One of the most important things Dennis Rodman brought to wrestling was his ability to blur the lines between legitimate sports and sports entertainment. That might sound like a small thing, but it's actually huge. Wrestling has always thrived when it feels connected to the wider world. When real athletes show up. When mainstream stars get involved. When there's a sense that what's happening on screen matters beyond the wrestling bubble. Rodman gave wrestling that feeling. He made it feel like the worlds of the NBA and professional wrestling were colliding. And that kind of crossover created excitement that pure wrestling storylines sometimes couldn't create on their own. People tuned in because they were curious. What is Dennis Rodman doing here? Is he serious? Is he actually wrestling? What is he going to wear? What crazy thing is he going to say? How far is this going to go? That unpredictability is incredibly powerful. And Dennis Rodman was one of the most unpredictable celebrities of his generation. That unpredictability made every appearance feel important. It made every segment feel like something wild could happen. And in wrestling, that's exactly what you want. There are certain celebrity appearances in wrestling history that become memorable not because the celebrity had technical wrestling skill, but because they understood how to become part of the spectacle. Rodman did that better than most. He didn't try to act like a polished wrestler. He didn't try to pretend he was something he wasn't. Instead, he leaned fully into being Dennis Rodman, loud, outrageous, chaotic, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. That authenticity made his appearances work. And then there's the visual side of it. Let's be honest, Dennis Rodman looked like a wrestling character even when he wasn't trying to. His outrageous outfits, his constantly changing look, his larger-than-life presence, and his willingness to push boundaries made him unforgettable. When he appeared in wrestling, he didn't tone any of that down. If anything, he amplified it. He understood that wrestling is a visual medium. He understood that how you look matters. He understood that if people are going to remember you, you need to give them something unforgettable. And Rodman always gave people something unforgettable. Who could forget the promos? Who could forget the way he carried himself? Who could forget the sheer weirdness and unpredictability of seeing one of the NBA's biggest stars fully embrace the madness of pro wrestling? Those weren't just funny or shocking moments. They were meaningful moments in the broader story of wrestling's expansion into mainstream pop culture. That's what makes this Hall of Fame discussion more legitimate than some people think. Because Dennis Rodman's wrestling legacy isn't built on technical wrestling achievements. It's built on cultural impact. It's built on visibility. It's built on crossover influence. It's built on the idea that wrestling became more interesting, more talked about, and more culturally connected, because people like Dennis Rodman were willing to jump into the chaos. And that's worth something. Now, the other interesting part of this conversation is that the Hall of Fame itself is often about storytelling. Let's be real. WWE doesn't always treat the Hall of Fame like a strict sports institution. It's part celebration, part history lesson, part nostalgia trip, and part entertainment product. WWE has always used the Hall of Fame to celebrate not only the biggest in-ring legends, but also the people who made wrestling feel bigger than life. And if that's the standard, then Dennis Rodman actually fits better than many critics want to admit. Because Rodman didn't just appear in wrestling. He made wrestling feel bigger. He made it feel more mainstream. He made it feel like the outside world was paying attention. That is a major contribution. And if WWE were to induct him in 2026, it wouldn't be because they're pretending he had a full-time wrestling career. It would be because they're acknowledging that he helped create some of the most unforgettable crossover celebrity moments of his era. That's a very different kind of Hall of Fame case, but it's still a valid one. Another thing worth mentioning is that celebrity involvement in wrestling has always mattered more than hardcore fans sometimes admit. From the earliest days of WrestleMania, WWE understood the power of celebrity. Celebrities help validate wrestling to wider audiences. They create press. They generate curiosity. They give fans something different. They can create iconic moments that live forever in highlight packages. Dennis Rodman did exactly that. He brought that what is happening right now, energy that great wrestling thrives on. He made people stop and look. And when people stop and look, they tune in. When they tune in, they talk. When they talk, the business grows. That's why his legacy in wrestling, while unconventional, is still important. And honestly, that word unconventional might be the best way to describe Dennis Rodman as a whole. His basketball career was unconventional. His public image was unconventional. His style was unconventional. His life has always been unconventional. So why should his Hall of Fame case be any different? If Dennis Rodman gets inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, it would actually be perfectly in character. It would be weird. It would be surprising. It would make some people angry. It would make some people laugh. It would make some people say, wait, what? And then, after the initial shock, a lot of people would start remembering just how much buzz he actually brought to wrestling. That's the magic of Rodman. He forces people to talk. Even now, even in 2026. And that alone tells you something. If his name being discussed can still create debate, excitement, and strong reactions, that means his connection to wrestling clearly left a mark. Maybe not in the traditional sense. Maybe not in the work rate sense. Maybe not in the 5-star match sense. But definitely in the cultural sense. And wrestling is built on culture as much as competition. So, would Dennis Rodman being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame be shocking? Yes. Would it be controversial? Absolutely. Would some fans hate it? Without question. But would it also make sense once you really think about what the Hall of Fame is supposed to represent? Honestly, yes. Because Dennis Rodman represents a specific era. He represents a time when wrestling was wild, mainstream, rebellious, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. He represents the collision between sports and entertainment. He represents celebrity crossover done in a way that actually felt memorable. He represents the kind of unpredictability that makes wrestling fun. And he represents the idea that impact doesn't always come from longevity. Sometimes impact comes from moments. And Dennis Rodman had moments. That's what this whole Hall of Fame conversation really comes down to. Not whether he had the most matches. Not whether he had the longest run. Not whether he was a traditional wrestler. But whether his presence in the wrestling world mattered enough to be remembered and honored. And the answer to that, for a lot of fans, is yes. Now, if WWE does move forward with this and officially includes Dennis Rodman in the Hall of Fame class of 2026, the presentation will matter a lot. If they frame it correctly as a recognition of crossover impact, celebrity influence, and unforgettable sports entertainment moments, then it could actually be a really strong addition to the class. If they try to sell it like he was some major full-time wrestling figure, that's where the backlash would get louder. The key is honesty. Celebrate him for what he actually was. A larger-than-life celebrity who stepped into wrestling and made noise. A global sports icon who helped bring extra eyes to the business. A chaos agent whose presence created unforgettable moments. That's the lane. And in that lane, Dennis Rodman absolutely has a case. What's also fascinating is how time changes the way we look at wrestling history. In the moment, some celebrity appearances can feel like stunts. They can feel disposable. They can feel like short-term buzz. But years later, when you look back, some of those same appearances become iconic, because they captured the spirit of an era. Dennis Rodman's wrestling appearances captured the spirit of the late 1990s perfectly. Over the top, unpredictable, celebrity-driven, boundary-pushing, wildly entertaining. That's why they still get talked about. That's why his name still resonates. That's why this Hall of Fame rumor has people reacting the way they are. Because even if you don't think he deserves it, you definitely remember him. And in wrestling, being remembered is powerful. So can Dennis Rodman actually make it into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2026? Yes, he absolutely can. And if WWE wants to lean into the celebrity crossover legacy, the mainstream sports connection, and the nostalgia of that era, he might actually be one of the most logical surprise picks they could make. Would it be traditional? No. Would it be expected? Not at all. Would it get people talking? Immediately. And maybe that's the most Dennis Rodman Hall of Fame move possible. Because Dennis Rodman has never done things the traditional way. He has always existed outside the normal rules. And if his wrestling legacy gets honored the same way, it would honestly be fitting. At the end of the day, the WWE Hall of Fame isn't just about ring stats. It's about moments. It's about memories. It's about impact. It's about who helped shape the feeling of wrestling in a given era. Dennis Rodman helped shape that feeling, even if only for a short time. Even if in a completely unconventional way. Even if it still confuses people today. That confusion, that excitement, that unpredictability, that's part of what made him special. So if Dennis Rodman really does end up in the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026, don't just look at the match count. Look at the headlines. Look at the crossover attention. Look at the spectacle. Look at the era. Look at the buzz. Because when you do, the case becomes a lot stronger than people think. And honestly, that might be the biggest twist of all. A Hall of Fame induction that sounds ridiculous at first, but actually makes a surprising amount of sense once you really break it down. So what do you think? Does Dennis Rodman deserve a spot in the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026? Do you see him as a legitimate celebrity contributor to wrestling history? Or do you think this would be one of the most random and unnecessary inductions WWE has ever done? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is definitely one of those topics where fans are going to be split right down the middle. And if you're as passionate about wrestling news, rumors, analysis, Hall of Fame debates, and all the chaos that comes with sports entertainment as we are, make sure you stay tuned for more. Because if this Dennis Rodman story is any indication, the road to the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026 is already getting very, very interesting. Thanks for the watching and subscribe.